The wind over the Persian heartlands carried the smell of empire. From the mountains of Media to the deserts of Babylon, the banners of Xerxes fluttered like waves in a sea of conquest. Persia, the mightiest power on earth, stood at the height of its glory, and its ambition knew no end. Xerxes, son of Darius the Great, looked westward across the Aegean Sea. His father had fallen short of subduing the defiant Greeks, his fleet shattered at Marathon decades earlier. And now the son vowed to finish what the father began. 1,000 nations were gathered beneath his command: Medes, Egyptians, Scythians, Indians, and even conquered Greeks. The great king was not merely waging war, he was orchestrating destiny. Susa to Sardis, roads trembled under the march of millions. Horses neighed, wheels clattered, drums thundered across the plains. The engineers of Persia built bridges across seas, cutting through mountains, commanding nature itself. The Hellespont, that narrow strait dividing Asia and Europe, was chained by floating pontoons of timber and rope. When a storm destroyed them, Xerxes had the waters whipped, as if punishing the sea itself for its defiance. His empire stretched farther than any before it, yet the Greek mainland stood like a thorn in his pride. To Xerxes, it was a rebellion that refused to kneel. To the Greeks, it was freedom that refused to die. As the massive Persian host advanced westward, the sound of its march echoed like thunder over the mountains. Towns emptied before it, fields burned beneath it, messengers raced across Greece, with dire warnings: the great king is coming. But among the noise of panic, a single city prepared to stand, a place where courage was carved into the very soul of its people: Sparta. In Athens, the air was thick with argument. In Corinth, fear outweighed resolve. And across the city-states of Greece, leaders gathered to debate a question that would decide the fate of their world. Should they stand and fight, or bow and survive? For Greece was not one nation. It was a collection of rivals, bound by language and gods, yet divided by politics and pride. Sparta, the warrior state, ruled the land through discipline and steel. Athens, the jewel of democracy, ruled the sea through wit and words. Thebes hesitated, Corinth calculated, and the smaller states waited to see which side would prevail. While others debated, Sparta decided. King Leonidas, the warrior king, listened to the warnings from Delphi, prophecies that spoke of either the fall of Sparta or the death of a king. He chose the latter. He would not allow Greece to die divided. At the Council of Corinth, Leonidas stood before the quarreling leaders and spoke few words, but each one carried the weight of iron. The Persians will not wait for our agreement. While you speak, they march. The room fell silent. The Spartans, it was said, spoke little because their deeds did the talking. The plan was simple, yet desperate. A narrow coastal pass in northern Greece, called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, could hold the Persian tide, if defended by few against many. There, the mountains pressed against the sea, forcing any army to fight in a confined space. While Athens prepared its navy, Leonidas would march north with a small advance force, a mere 300 Spartans, each accompanied by a few hundred allies. It was not an army meant to win. It was an army meant to show Greece how to stand. As the debates raged and fear spread, one truth became clear. If Greece were to survive, it would not be through numbers, but through will. The dawn over Sparta broke in silence. In the shadow of Mount Taygetus, the warriors assembled. These were not mere soldiers, they were products of a lifetime of discipline, molded by the harshest system of training the world had ever known, the agog. Every Spartan boy was raised to fight, to endure pain, and to place the state above himself. Cowardice was worse than death. Honor was everything. King Leonidas selected his 300 not for strength alone, but for their experience, their unity, and their bloodlines. Each man chosen was a father, so that their sons might remember them. Mothers did not weep. They commanded their sons to return, with their shield or on it. Wives watched their husbands depart with quiet pride. For to die for Sparta was not a tragedy, it was the highest calling. As the column marched out of the city, red cloaks flapping against the morning wind, Elders and children lined the streets. They carried no banners of farewell, no cries of despair, only the weight of ancient duty. The 300 were joined by allies, Thespians, Thebans, and a few thousand other Greeks. But all eyes rested on the Spartans. Their armor gleamed, their faces calm, their steps measured. One of them, Dienekis, when told that the Persian arrows would blot out the sun, replied, "Then we shall fight in the shade." They marched north toward Thermopylae, toward the narrow pass between cliff and sea, where history itself would hold its breath. Thermopylae. A strip of land, barely wide enough for a wagon to pass, where the cliffs of Mount Kalidromos rose steeply on one side, and the waters of the Malian Gulf stretched to the other. Steam hissed from the nearby sulfur springs, the hot gates from which the place took its name. For any army, it was a nightmare to cross, and for a small defending force, it was the perfect trap. Leonidas surveyed the terrain with the precision of a hunter. The narrowest part of the pass would force the Persians to attack head-on, nullifying their numbers. The Spartans began fortifying, an ancient wall that blocked the route, rebuilding it stone by stone. When scouts reported the approach of the Persian army, a dust cloud stretching beyond sight, the Spartans did not tremble. They oiled their hair, polished their shields, and prepared to meet eternity. The locals who watched whispered that the Spartans behaved not like men doomed to die, but like men preparing for a festival. As the sun set, the horizon burned red, with the light of countless Persian campfires. The sea shimmered with the reflections of their ships. To the east, drums echoed across the night like the beating of a giant heart. Yet in the narrow pass, only silence reigned. The Spartans stood in perfect formation, shields locked, waiting. Leonidas walked among them, speaking quietly, not of glory, but of duty, of the simple truth that freedom must be earned again in every generation. Behind them lay Greece, unprepared, divided, frightened. Before them lay an empire that called itself eternal, and between them, the hot gates. At dawn, the horizon became a moving wall of dust and steel. The Persian army, the largest ever assembled by human hands, emerged like a living tide. It was said that when they drank from rivers, the waters ran dry. When they marched, the earth itself trembled. At their head rode Xerxes, the great king, in a gilded chariot surrounded by immortals, his personal guard, dressed in lamellar armor, their spears glittering like a forest of silver. Behind him came horsemen from Bactria, archers from Egypt, swordsmen from Lydia, and warriors from distant India, their elephants trumpeting among the ranks. To the Greeks, it was as though the world itself had risen to devour them. Scouts raced back to Leonidas. "They are countless." The Spartan king nodded. "Then we shall count their dead." The Persians halted before the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Xerxes sent a messenger demanding surrender. He promised wealth, mercy, and dominion if the Greeks would kneel. Leonidas's reply would echo through millennia, "Come and take them." Xerxes laughed. He had crushed kingdoms for less defiance. But now, as he looked upon the narrow defile guarded by a few hundred men, curiosity stayed his wrath. He sent forth his Medes first, confident they would scatter the Greeks before sunset. The drums began to thunder. Down the slope they came, shields flashing, arrows whistling overhead. The ground shook with the charge of 10,000 men, and then the Medes met the Spartan wall. Bronze rang against bronze, spears broke, shields locked, men screamed, and the tide recoiled. Again and again they charged, and each time they were thrown back, their bodies piling in the dust. The narrow pass had become a funnel of death, where Persian numbers meant nothing. When night fell, the Greeks still stood, their formation unbroken. Leonidas gave no victory speech. He merely said, "We will do the same tomorrow." The second day began beneath a red sun and a haze of smoke. The Persians renewed their assault with fresh divisions, the immortals, elite soldiers chosen for their skill and loyalty. They advanced in perfect rhythm, their scale armor glinting, like fish in a dark current. The Spartans awaited them in silence. When the immortals struck, the clash was so violent it seemed the mountains themselves were echoing the sound of steel. Spears shattered, Men grappled hand to hand, and blood soaked the stones beneath their feet. The narrow terrain worked its cruel magic again. The Persians could not deploy their archers, their cavalry, or their numbers. They fought in waves, crashing against an immovable wall of shields and discipline. Each Spartan fought not for himself, but for the man beside him. If one fell, another took his place. Their rhythm was like that of a machine forged from flesh and willpower. Witnesses said the Persians' dead were so numerous that Leonidas's men fought standing atop corpses. At midday, Xerxes watched from his throne carved into the cliffside. His generals begged him to withdraw and regroup, but pride blinded him. He could not accept that his endless army was being halted by a handful of men. As evening approached, the Spartans executed a tactical feint, pretending to retreat, drawing the Persians into the narrowest part of the pass, then turning suddenly to strike with a ferocity that shattered the enemy's confidence. For 2 days, Thermopylae had become a slaughterhouse. The Persians had lost tens of thousands, the Greeks only a few dozen. And yet, Leonidas knew victory was an illusion. The Persians would keep coming. Their strength was in their endlessness. The Greeks was in their spirit. Night fell over the hot gates again, and the wind carried the smell of death and salt. Leonidas sat among his men by the fire, sharpening his blade in silence. One Spartan said softly, "Tomorrow they will attack again." Leonidas nodded. "Then tomorrow we will make history." By the third morning, the Persians had begun to lose faith. They had thrown everything, elite warriors, archers, cavalry, but the pass remained impassable. Xerxes grew furious. He had ordered his soldiers forward with the whip. The screams of the dying mingled with the crash of shields. The Greek phalanx stood firm, its rhythm never breaking. Each movement, each strike, each shield placement was drilled from birth. Theirs was not courage born of passion. It was habit, forged from childhood discipline. The Persians adapted, using arrows to soften the defenders before charging again. The sky darkened with thousands of shafts. But the Spartans, crouched behind their shields, endured the storm. When the arrows stopped, they rose as one, spears ready, eyes burning beneath bronze helmets. The Persian charge met them like a wave breaking against rock. Again and again, the Spartans advanced a few steps, then withdrew, drawing the enemy deeper, striking at their flanks. The ground was slick with blood. Among the allies, the Thespians refused to yield. The Phocians held the mountain path behind them. The wall of unity remained unbroken. By dusk, the Persians were demoralized. Leonidas's men, though exhausted and wounded, still stood unbroken. The hot gates had become a graveyard for imperial arrogance. That night, as the fires burned low, Leonidas gazed toward the distant flicker of Persian torches. He knew the truth that few dared speak. No wall, however brave, could hold forever. And, somewhere in the darkness, betrayal was already stirring. His name would be cursed for eternity, Ephialtes, the outcast of Greece. Deformed, bitter, and hungry for recognition, he came to the Persian camp under the cover of night, his torch trembling in the wind. Before Xerxes, he knelt and revealed what no army of scouts had found, a hidden mountain path around Thermopylae, used by shepherds and traders. A path that would lead the Persians behind the Greek line. For gold and glory, he sold his homeland. Xerxes listened, eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. He summoned his elite immortals, ordering them to follow Ephialtes through the darkness. Torches flickered like a serpent slithering up the mountain. At dawn, Greek scouts saw them too late. The Phocians who guarded the path were overwhelmed. The trap was closing. When Leonidas learned of the betrayal, he did not curse the gods or despair. He simply gathered his captains and gave the order for the allies to withdraw. "Go and tell the cities what we did here." The Thespians refused to leave. "We stay," they said. "We will die beside you." Leonidas nodded. To fight beside such men was honor enough. As the sun rose on the fourth day, the Spartans and Thespians took their final positions. They knew the end was near, but their stand would echo through eternity. Leonidas stood before his men one last time. "Eat well," he said, For tonight we dine in Hades. The Persians advanced from both sides now, front and rear. Trumpets blared. The hot gates became a cauldron of chaos. Shields clashed, swords splintered, men fell in heaps. Leonidas fought in the front rank, his spear a blur of motion. When it broke, he drew his sword. When that shattered, he fought with his hands. He was struck by countless arrows, his body pierced, but unbent. As the last Spartan fell, the mountain echoed with the roar of victory, but also with a silence that terrified the conquerors. For they had won a battle, but awakened a legend. The sun rose blood-red over Thermopylae. Smoke drifted between the cliffs, heavy with the stench of ash and death. The last of the Greek defenders stood battered but unbroken, their shields splintered, their spears shattered. Around them, the Four. Bodies of thousands of Persians lay heaped in silence, a monument to defiance carved not in stone, but in flesh. Leonidas knew the end had come. The Persians had encircled the pass completely. Yet, as he looked at his men, eyes hollow from exhaustion but still burning with purpose, he felt no fear, only pride. "Brothers," he said quietly, "the world will forget many things, but not this." The Spartans formed up one final time, no formation, no strategy, just a wall of will. They advanced downhill into the Persian ranks, shouting their war cry, "Ares! Ares!" The shock of their charge sent a ripple through the enemy lines. Even in death's shadow, the Spartans fought like lions. Their bronze armor was cracked, their red cloaks blackened with blood, but they moved with precision, each swing, each strike, as disciplined as their first day. Leonidas cut his way through the immortals until his spear broke. Then he drew his sword. When that shattered, he fought with his hands. His final act was not surrender, but defiance, standing tall even as arrows blotted out the sky. He fell where he stood, surrounded by his men. The Persians, awed by the ferocity of their enemy, hesitated to approach even their fallen king. It was Xerxes himself who ordered that Leonidas's body be taken, a prize for the conqueror. But even in death, Leonidas denied him peace. His death transformed defeat into immortality. The Greeks had lost the battle, but gained a symbol no empire could destroy. When the smoke cleared, Thermopylae was silent. The cliffs that once echoed with the clash of swords now whispered only to the sea. The Persians buried their dead by the thousands. The Greeks, few enough to count, were left where they fell, unbent, unbowed. Xerxes, though victorious, could not shake the unease in his heart. He had triumphed over 300 men, yet lost the aura of invincibility that surrounded his empire. For in that narrow pass, the myth of Persian omnipotence had been shattered. He ordered Leonidas's head placed upon a spear, a message to Greece. But far from sowing fear, it ignited fury. Across the Greek world, the story spread like wildfire. In Athens, in Corinth, in Arcadia, people whispered of the 300 who stood against the impossible. Songs were sung, oaths were sworn, tears were shed, not for sorrow, but for pride. Thermopylae became more than a battlefield. It became a mirror in which every Greek saw what it meant to be free. The Persians continued south, burning cities, ravaging fields, advancing toward Athens. Yet at every turn they found resistance harder, more resolute. Thermopylae had changed. The spirit of Greece. Months later, at Salamis, the Greek navy, outnumbered yet united, would trap and annihilate the Persian fleet. A year later, at Plataea, the last remnants of Xerxes' army would be crushed. The spark born at Thermopylae had ignited a fire that would consume an empire. In the end, the Persians won the pass, but lost the war, and Leonidas's stand, though small in scale, became eternal in meaning. Centuries passed, and yet the name Thermopylae never faded. Kings rose and fell, empires flourished and vanished, but still men spoke of the place where 300 chose death over dishonor. Historians would write of tactics, geography, and politics, but the true legacy of Thermopylae lived not in the strategy of the battle, but in the spirit of sacrifice. For the Spartans, courage was not the absence of fear, it was the mastery of it. Their code taught that freedom must always be defended, even against impossible odds. Philosophers would later call it the triumph of the few over the many. Generals across history, from Caesar to Napoleon, studied Leonidas's stand as a lesson in morale and discipline. But poets, far more than warriors, captured its essence, that a man's worth is measured not by how long he lives, but by what he is willing to die for. Even the Persians, centuries later, would speak of the Spartans with reluctant respect. In Persian chronicles, Thermopylae was remembered not as a victory, but as a warning, that arrogance, no matter how vast, meets its end at the edge of human will. In the ruins of Sparta, inscriptions would one day bear these words: "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. The stone still stands weathered by time, yet untouched by oblivion. And though the names of kings and conquerors fade, the story of those who stood and fell at Thermopylae endures, a flame that burns brighter with every retelling. The Volga has its Stalingrad, the Rhine has its Waterloo. The steppes have their Mongol storms, but long before them all, there was Thermopylae, where men, hopelessly outnumbered, chose eternity over survival. Stand today upon the narrow pass, and the sea still murmurs against the rocks, as if whispering the names of the dead. The mountains remain, silent witnesses to courage beyond reason. There is no empire left from Xerxes' glory. The palaces of Susa and Persepolis have turned to dust. But the courage of 300 men, that remains carved into the world's memory, for Thermopylae was not the end of a battle. It was the beginning of an idea. That freedom is not given. It is claimed, kept, and when needed, bought again with blood. When modern soldiers march into war, when nations stand against tyranny, when people defy impossible odds, somewhere, in spirit, Leonidas and his 300 march with them. History remembers many conquests. But Thermopylae remembers defiance, and as the sun sets upon those ancient cliffs, the wind still carries their unspoken vow. Come and take them,